hi everyone. Welcome to the Master Forum series organized by the IRDR ICOE Taipei. And I am Junchen Li, Executive Director of ICOE Taipei. As some of you know, the ICOE Taipei is a center under International IRDR program. And we are mostly focusing on the emphasize capacity building on disaster risk reduction through international training courses, workshop in past 10, 11 years already. And during the pandemic time, we began to test it another way to continue our activity. And Master Forum series as one of them. And we began last year, so today will be the second one. And I'm really happy today. We will have Professor Gabriel Bammer to join us to give us a lecture here. And before doing that, I will ask Yugao Chen, Professor Yugao Chen, Exclusive Secretary of Center of Sustainability Science of Academia Sinica, as a representative of Academia Sinica, to give us an opening remarks. Please, Yugao.
Thank you, Jensen and Professor Bammer. Sorry for the technical problem just now, but let's restart. Welcome to join this Master Forum today. On behalf of the host organization, Academia Sinica, I'm more than happy, honored to present you the speaker for today's Master Forum IRDR ICOE Taipei, Dr. Gabriel Bammer. Dr. Bammer has long been well known on her work using interdisciplinary approach to solve complex problems that we are facing in the modern world. As we know, traditional single discipline-based operations are usually not enough to overcome complex obstacles we have. We really need multidisciplinary knowledge to form robust solutions sometimes. Further, as we can feel, especially today, some problems are really urgent. The time is taking before the problem become unrecoverable. These challenges needs innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and engagement with stakeholders. Then we can effectively turn the situation backwards. Today's lecture topic is exactly what we want to learn. What expertise do you need to tackle complex interdisciplinary problems? I believe this is an important lesson to help us take the right way to for the related scientific approaches in the future. Academia Sinica Taiwan has recognized the value of sustainability science for decades, and is deeply aware the key to its success is to transform knowledge into action. Therefore, dedicated to working on relevant promotion, including IRDR ICOE Taipei. This is one international program hosted by our Center for Sustainability Science at Academia Sinica, which was established to conquer the complex problem on disaster risk reduction related, which need interdisciplinary collaboration very much. I believe it's key to conquer the problem. I understand today's talk is highly valued and welcomed internationally. I'm sure we will have all benefit a lot today. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Professor Bammer. Also, thank you all for your patience and today's participation. Wish you all stay safe and healthy. Look forward to more opportunities working together in the future. Back to Jensen.
Thank you, Yugao. So before we going through, let me remind it to everyone, in audience, that we will have a 50 minutes talk by Professor Gabriel Bammer, and followed by 15-20 minutes Q&A. And for who like to ask questions, please write them down with your name and affiliation, please, in YouTube chat box. We will collect them and pursue it in after the talk. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, that's welcome, Professor Gabriel Bammer. Gabriel, your turn.
Great, thank you very much. And hi, everybody. So let me begin by apologising for not being able to join you when I was scheduled to talk last time. I'm just waiting for my, there we go, to share my screen. And I should say that these slides are also available in PDF form for anybody who would like them. So as I said, my apologies for not being able to talk 3 weeks ago when I was scheduled. My father was unwell, and I'm very grateful that you've delayed this talk. So I want to talk to you about the expertise that you need to tackle complex interdisciplinary problems. I'm not going to specifically talk about disaster risk reduction, but I'm going to talk about all kinds of research, including what you need for disaster risk reduction, that works with a range of disciplines and stakeholders, and that really tries to make real-world change happen. So I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to give you a general overview of the expertise that's needed. I'm going to try and give you some insights into some key elements of that expertise. And because there's much more expertise that's needed than there is time available, I'm going to finish by talking about where to find out more. So let me begin by talking about what expertise is. And important here are 2 kinds of expertise for this kind of work. The first is contributory expertise, which is the expertise that you need to make a substantive contribution to a field, in this case, in interdisciplinarity. And it's comprised of knowing things and knowing how to do things. So one way of thinking about it is know that and know how. The other expertise that's important in interdisciplinary work is being able to understand disciplines and professional practice and communities without being trained in those disciplines or professions or having lived in those communities. It's a kind of, as it's called, interactional expertise. It's an empathy for other ways of doing things. In this talk, I'm going to focus on contributory expertise. So let's begin with the general overview of the expertise that's needed. And the first thing that you need for tackling complex problems is an understanding of what it is that makes problems complex. So I'm going to suggest that there are 6 things. The first of those is a systems understanding. So by this I mean understanding that problems really don't have real boundaries. They have boundaries that we impose on them. They have feedback loops which can be reinforcing, making the problem worse and worse, or balancing to keep the problem in check. They can have things like nonlinearity or delays or tipping points. The really important thing about systems is that there are no clearly defined limits around a system, and so we have to make those limits when we tackle the problem. The second thing is the importance of diversity. So people who are involved in problems differ in many different ways. So we differ in our values, we differ in our interests, we differ in our epistemologies, in our personalities, and we also differ in how we understand and define the problem. And what this means is that it's really hard to get a clear problem definition. The third thing that's important is change. If we want to make change happen or stop change from happening, we need to understand that change is complex, that we're working in a dynamic change environment, but we might be in the rapids where things are happening very quickly, or we might be in a quiet backwater where nothing much is going on. If we want things to stay the same, or if we want to conserve things, that also requires work because we're in this dynamic environment, so things are going to change naturally. That once things have been established, there's inbuilt inertia or resistance to change, making things hard to change. That change doesn't necessarily lead to improvement. that whether or not change is successful depends on who's making that judgment. It's in the eye of the beholder. And finally, that if you're trying to make change happen, the outcomes are going to be unpredictable. So you can set things in motion, but you can't control where they go. So the key lesson here is that control is a necessary, but actually it's quite a dangerous illusion. The next thing that's important for understanding complex problems is context. So we have to understand the relevant historical, cultural, political, economic, and other circumstances in which the problem occurs. We need to understand what gives us the authority to work on a particular problem, and we need to understand the impact of our institutional settings, both those that we work in and the institutional settings of the people that we're working with. And what that means is that there are multiple constraints on what is feasible. That's interesting. The next thing that's important are unknowns. My PowerPoint's just stopped progressing, which is really very annoying. So it's useful to, this is a useful metaphor for thinking about the unknown. So it's useful to think about what we know as an island in an infinite sea of what we don't know. And if you think about it, as our knowledge grows, the island also grows. And the shoreline, which is what we know we don't know, also grows. So this is a useful metaphor that tells us that regardless of how much we know, there will always be unknowns. And in fact, the more we know, the more we don't know. I'm sorry, I'm just going to stop sharing and start again. This is going to drive me crazy otherwise. See if that works. Yes. All right. So one of the reasons, and I talked about the unknown as being an infinite ocean. So one of the reasons that unknowns are infinite is that there's continuous innovation and change. We have ongoing research, which not only tells us stuff, but also raises new questions. There are some knowns that we can't know. There are limited methods for dealing with unknowns, and unknowns also have benefits. And not only are unknowns infinite, but research capacity is finite. So even if every man, woman, and child became a researcher, we still couldn't know everything that there is to know. Another useful thing to know about unknowns is this matrix that some of you will have seen, that there are three kinds of unknowns. There are the unknowns that we know we don't know, the conscious ignorance. There's what we don't know we know, which is tacit knowledge. And there's what we don't know, which is meta-ignorance. I could spend a long time talking about those, but I'm not going to. The point that I'm trying to make here is that when we're dealing with complex problems, there are multiple unknowns that we're ill-equipped to handle. So if we put all this together, that brings us to the final aspect of complex problems, which is imperfection. So because problems are systems problems that have no clear boundaries, because we have so many different kinds of people involved, and the problems can't be clearly defined, because change is so complex, because context is so complex, and because unknowns are unknowable, we can never have perfect solutions to the problems that we're trying to solve. In other words, solutions can only ever be partial or temporary. So when we're trying to build expertise, we need to have expertise in these 6 elements, but we also need a little bit more than that. We need to be able to understand how to work with people. We need to be able to understand how to encourage participation of multiple disciplines, and also about how to work with stakeholders, the people who are affected by the problem and the people who are in a position to do something about the problem. In addition, what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the problem, which means we need expertise in integration. We need to be able to support decision-making and action. So we want to be able to support policy and practice change in government, in business, and in civil society. And we want to be able to do that based on evidence or the implementation of our research. And finally, having effective communication skills are essential. So to put all this together, I'm going to argue that there are 11 domains in which we need expertise, the ones that I've talked about, and that are listed here on the left. And in each of these, we need both know that and know how. So let me give some insights into some key elements of this kind of expertise. So I've given you the overview, and now what is it that we actually need to know? So let's start with the know that. And I've already given you some examples of know that, so I want to go back over those quickly. So we have, if we want to be good at solving complex problems or dealing with complex problems, we need to know some things about systems, these kinds of things that I've put up earlier. We need to know some things about the unknown, again, these kinds of things that I talked about earlier. And finally, we need to know some things about change. So these are examples. So we need to understand why change is complex by understanding these kinds of things that I talked about earlier. So it's not just know that we need. We also need to know how to do things. And I'm going to give you two examples, which are both also tied in with a little bit more know that. So I'm going to talk about diversity and integration. So let's start with diversity. There are a whole range of different kinds of diversity. So we often think about gender and age and culture. I'm sure we have quite a lot of diversity of those things in this call. There is also diversity in terms of the stage of your career, in the disciplinary expertise, in our comfort with unknowns and ambiguity, in mental models, how we think the world works, in values, power, personality. And let me just flesh some of these out in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, let's just talk a little bit more about diversity as both an asset and a liability. So diversity is an asset because it gives us more ways of conceiving a problem. It gives us more ways of understanding a problem. It gives us more ways of figuring out what the unknowns are, especially in understanding unknown unknowns. And it gives us more ways of acting on a problem. But it's also a liability because it makes it harder for us to work together. If we want to manage diversity, if we want to be able to work together effectively in the face of diversity, it's key to understand how we are different. And often when we understand that we're different from each other and we're not trying to be, we're not trying to irritate each other, it's just that we see the world differently. That irritation can melt, that we often feel when we're working with people who aren't quite the same as us, can just melt away. So let's go back to talking about some ways of handling these different kinds of diversity and gaining the kind of understanding that can help those irritations melt away. One common example is personality tests, and certainly in Australia, it's very common as part of leadership training to be given a personality test and for all your colleagues to be given personality tests as well, and for that to be used to understand how you're different from each other. And I'd be interested to hear if that's also a common experience in the countries that you're in. Let me move on to values. There's a great tool that's been developed by Schwartz, who's built this, what he would argue is a global understanding of values that he says works for every country. I'm not going to have time to talk about this in any detail here, but what I want to do is to make you aware that tools like this exist, and there's a reference to the tool here, and there's also a reference to a questionnaire that you can use to measure values. But what he argues is that we can be very different people can be very different in the kinds of values that they have. So people who are very open to change have very different set of values from people who are interested in conserving things. And that can also lead to friction between people. And again, if you can understand that you have different values and how they're different, that can help overcome some of that friction. I also want to talk about mental models because this is really important when we're trying to work together in a research context. Mental models are how we understand the world and how it works. So they're also known as our worldviews or our basic assumptions. Each of us understands how the world works differently. And mental models are in our minds. They're our own private images or other representations or thought processes about what things are and how things work in the real world. And they're subjective, they're incomplete, and sometimes they're wrong. They're all simplifications of reality, but they play a major role in how we think and reason and make decisions. I just want to give you a very brief example. So let's just look at the concept of a chair. So I think most of us would agree that this is a chair. I suspect that most of our mental models about what a chair is would include this as something that a chair is. But what about this? If we had time, we could do a survey, and my hunch is that there are a group of people in the audience who would say, yes, this is also a chair, and there are a group of people in the audience who would say, no, this is not a chair. And let's go to something like this. Again, I think there'd be some people in the audience who would say, yes, this is a chair, and some people who would say, no, this is not a chair. And the point of this is really to illustrate how different our mental models are. Not just about something simple like a chair, but also about something more complex, like what is a disaster? My hunch is that we've got very different understandings of a disaster within the group. And we have different understandings of not just concrete things, but also unconcrete things like trust and value and a whole lot, everything basically that we think about. There's no easy test for mental models because they incorporate everything in the world around us. But we uncover our differences in mental models by working together. And this often happens when we're trying to build a model together. People say, well, this needs to go in the model, and somebody else says, no, it doesn't, it's not relevant. And so that discussion about what needs to go into a model and what doesn't need to go into a model is a great way of uncovering different people's mental models. So in terms of understanding diversity, the kind of expertise that we need is we need to know what diversity is, and we also need to know how to understand different types of diversity. We need to be able to harness different types of diversity, and we need to be able to manage the discomfort and conflict that arise from diversity. So let's move on now to integration. So integration has three dimensions. It's about bringing together people and ideas and values that were previously separate. It's about creating a coherent and comprehensive whole from those previously separate parts. And it's about staying alert to the things that don't fit. So there'll be unknowns and outliers, just things that just don't fit into a new coherent whole. So you need to understand that integration can never be complete or perfect. This is part of the imperfection that I was talking about earlier. So if you want to think about integration, there are 5 key questions. Why are we integrating? When? By whom? How? And what about the outliers? So why do we integrate? We want to bring together knowledge from different disciplines and stakeholders. And 2 types of stakeholders, just to reiterate that, people who have the problem and people who have the ability to do something about the problem. And we want to build a more comprehensive understanding of the problem, and we want to be able to more effectively support improvement via policy and practice change. When we do the integration, if we do it at the end, this is typical of multidisciplinary research. In multidisciplinary research, we often have each discipline do how it thinks about the problem and deal with it in its own way. And at the end, we try to bring all those different understandings together. If we're doing interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research, there's a substantial amount of integration that happens at the beginning in the way that we define the problem and who we decide to invite to participate in the problem. So and each of these has its benefits and disadvantages. So I'm not arguing that one's better than the other, but I'm just saying that there are different times when you can do integration and they lead to different ways of looking at and understanding the problem. Who is going to do the integration? Well, one person could be in charge of it for a group. A subgroup can do it. The whole group, the whole team, the research team can do it. Or you can do different parts of integration if you're doing a really big problem, different parts of the integration can be done by a combination of these. So some things can be done by an individual, some things can be done by a subgroup, and some things can be done by the whole group. So how do we integrate? I'm going to argue that there are three different ways of integrating: dialogue, modelling, and a common metric. And I'm going to go through each of those in a little bit more detail. So dialogue actually underpins all integration, so talking together, but it's also a method by itself. And I'm going to say a little bit about the conditions for effective dialogue and something about formal dialogue methods. Certainly in Western countries, these are thought to be the conditions for effective dialogue. And again, I'd be interested to see what the view of these is in Taipei and other Asian countries that might be participating. So the idea is that you need to build a safe space where people feel comfortable saying what they think. You need to have an atmosphere of openness. You need to be good at listening. You need to be able to good at by asking people what they really mean when you don't understand it. And you need to balance advocacy and inquiry. So you need to be able to say what you think quite powerfully, but you also need to inquire to really understand what other people think. As colleagues and I have put together a set of dialogue methods, and this book's available free online for anybody who's interested. And certainly there are a range of methods that you can use in some situations where it's helpful to have formal dialogue methods. Sometimes you can do dialogue quite informally, obviously. And there are a range of methods here that may be useful. The second thing to do is to build something together, a second way of integration. On the earlier side, I talked about it as modelling. Modelling is, in fact, just one way of building something together. So you can build a thing, an artefact. And an example of a great example of building something together that was a great tool of integration was building the atomic bomb in the Second World War. Building a model together is also a very effective way of building something together. And developing a joint vision and using that to guide your research can also be really effective. And the World Commission on Dams, which was active a few years ago, was very good at building a joint vision about when dams should be built and when they should be decommissioned. So building something together is a great tool for integration. A common metric is the third tool for integration, and this is about finding a metric or measure that everything can be converted to, that, and then the integration is really just adding up, right? So dollar value, which economists use, is a great integrative tool. So you convert everything to a dollar value and then you just add it up. Ecosystem services uses the same principle. And then we've got some other common metrics that people have developed as well. So as I said, we've got these three kinds of integration: dialogue, building something together, of which modelling is one, and common metrics. But then what do we do to manage the unknowns and the outliers? So it's common to ignore them, which is probably the worst thing that you can do. You can leave them on the table, so you can say, I don't know what to do with these, but let's keep them let's keep some awareness of them in what we continue to do. And you can try to use them to have some creative dialogue around the things that we can't, you think this, I think that, and we really can't find a way of working together. So continuing to persevere to try and find some common ground can be really helpful. Certainly, we're not very good at the things that don't fit, and this needs a lot more development. So I've just tried to give you a quick overview of the different kinds of expertise, and I think it's very clear from this table that there's a lot that we haven't covered. So where can you find out more? And I guess it's also worth asking the question as to who should have this expertise. So let's deal with this second question first. Who should have this expertise? So should everybody have it? I'd argue that that's unrealistic. I think because we need people who've got strong disciplinary expertise too. We can't just have a world full of people who know how to work together, because then we've got nothing to work with, right? I think what is realistic is that everybody needs to be aware of this kind of expertise, this kind of integrative and implementation expertise, and where to find it. That's what I would argue that everybody needs to have, but then there needs to be a cadre of people who have this expertise in integration and implementation. As I said, I'd argue that there are specialists, and I've proposed elsewhere that what we need is actually a new discipline of integration and implementation sciences, which would operate a bit like statistics. It operates in conjunction with problems. So the discipline only makes sense if it's working in application. It helps people deal with complex problems. It's expertise that you want to have on a team that allows the team to work together effectively, to understand a systems perspective, to understand the complexities of making change happen, and that you have some people on the team who are specialists in that and in bringing that expertise to the team. So, places to get more information. So one of the things that I do is I run a blog, the Integration and Implementation Insights blog, and I've just given you 5 examples of blog posts that we publish. The purpose of the blog is to bring together this range of expertise from different people around the world who might not otherwise know each other. And it would be fantastic to have contributions from some of you about that. I'm sorry to have the phone ringing in the background. That's very annoying. So if any of you, I'd certainly welcome you reading the blog, but I'd also really welcome contributions to the blog based on your experience and the expertise that you've developed. We also have a website called the Integration and Implementation Sciences website, and this also has a number of tools that we curate and put on the website. So tools for knowledge synthesis, for dealing with unknowns, for providing research support for policy and practice change, and so on. And we provide regular updates of what we do through the news. So as well as the website and the blog, there's also a LinkedIn group. We also have a YouTube channel, and you can also contact me on Twitter or on email. So these are all ways in which I really value interacting with you further after this seminar is over. I did want to give you 2 key references. One is the book, Disciplining Interdisciplinary, which makes the case for a discipline of integration and implementation sciences. And the second is a paper that was published last year, which really focuses on this issue of expertise and how we can recognise and develop the expertise. So let me go back to this slide and say thank you very much. I hope I've left a good amount of time for discussion. So I can't hear you, which means you're either muted or something's not working properly.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's better.
I mute myself. Sorry for that. Okay, thank you, Gabriel. Thank you very much. It's an excellent talk. I learned a lot from your lectures. Very good. So it's time for audience to ask questions. So that's waiting for a little bit for if who would like to ask question online. So let me remind you again. So you can write down your question on YouTube chat box, and also please with your name and affiliation. Okay. Maybe let me just start it from Sherry Cole from Academia Sinica. He has 2 questions. The first one, you mentioned not everyone needs to have this expertise, but do you think this expertise can be trained?
Great. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do. You know, I think so. If you think about the disciplines that already exist, there are people who there's a combination of natural ability and interest, if you like, and a combination of what people have learnt. So people who are mathematicians generally tend to be quite different kinds of people from people who are anthropologists, for example. There's something about the way you are and what you're interested in that leads you to mathematics or anthropology. And I would say that there's also something about the way you are that would lead you to be an integration and implementation scientist, that you really like working with other people and you're really interested in how other people think. And so you need to be a certain way. I don't think everybody has the ability to become good at it. But then if you have that kind of basic personality and interest, then there are a bunch of skills that you can learn. And I hope I've kind of laid those out in the talk.
Okay, and he also mentioned, could it be trained in education system or any experience on job training? Do you have any, Gabriel? Do we have any idea on that?
That's a really good question. Thank you. So I would, at the moment, people are picking these skills up in a whole variety of ways. There's no in the paper that I finished with. There's no one place to go to get all of this expertise. And I guess I'm arguing that one of the things that a discipline would do is it would put all the expertise in one place and then make it something that universities could teach. And, maybe you would want some of it taught in schools as well as in universities. At the moment, people are learning on the job. So most people go in, and I suspect there are many of you who've had this experience. You go into a collaboration and you find that, well, you don't really know how to work together. And so you do it by trial and error, and you might read a little bit and you try some things and you've tried, you've done something that worked really well. You've had to run a meeting in a particular way and it was hugely successful. And then you've done some other things that haven't worked so well. So you've tried to get someone to change their mind in a particular way by kind of trying to convince them, and you might find that that wasn't so successful. So there are a whole lot of things that we learn through trial and error, and it's always going to be a little bit of a combination of that.
Okay. Okay. So the next question is asked by Shi Yu, a current PhD student in architecture major at Chengkong University in southern Taiwan. So he has a question about saying it's important to put those unknown partial into consideration. And how could we find out that we have encountered sufficient factors or involvers at a stage in making plan at the very beginning? And at what level could we define that the whole project has been scheduled in a relatively comprehensive condition? It's a complicated question.
It's a complicated question, but it's a great question. So just remember my slide about imperfection, right? And I think that your emphasis on comprehensiveness and sufficiency is the right way of thinking about it, right? So we're never going to have perfect answers, but when is what we have got good enough? And that's a really hard question to answer. I don't have the answer to that. I think that's one of the things we need to build together. One of the ways of thinking about it is if everybody's unhappy with you, then you're probably doing pretty well. If only one sector is unhappy with you, then you're probably biased in what you're trying to do. But if everybody's equally unhappy with what you're trying to do and saying, we want a little bit more, then you probably have a pretty good handle on the problem. That's a slightly cynical way of thinking about it, but it's one of the ways that it's helpful to think about when have we done enough is when people,
Okay, so next question is from Shirong Xu. I don't know from where, probably Academia Sinica. So his question is that, is it possible for us to have common metric?
So common metrics don't work for everything, but sometimes they're really convenient. So I think there'll be many of you who know about ecosystem services, and they can be a really useful common metric for thinking about how do we protect an environment, right? If we're working on a health problem, if we're trying to prioritize health issues, then something like disability adjusted life years can be a very helpful common metric. So it's not something that you would always use as an integrative tool, but sometimes it is useful. And some people really hate common metrics. So that's also important to understand.
Okay. So next question from Yunin Wang. Simple question: how to reduce unknown unknowns?
Simple question, complicated answer. So there are two kinds of unknown unknowns, right? So one is our own personal ignorance about things. So if, for example, I think there's only one kind of rice, if I was to talk to you and say, you know, there's only one kind of rice, it's the kind of rice that I have in my kitchen, you would be much more sophisticated about different kinds of rice, say to me, Gabriel, you're wrong. And so one way that we learn about what we don't know is by interacting with other people. And that's a really important thing to do because things that we think are a particular way, so that if we have a misunderstanding about the world, we can overcome that by interacting with other people. Then there are unknown unknowns that nobody knows about, where we just cannot see them happening. And I guess my favourite example was in the 1980s. Public health people were very confident that we had cured all communicable diseases, and that what we needed to do now was to focus on non-communicable diseases like heart disease and cancer and so on, and that infectious diseases we knew all the answers to. And then, of course, along came HIV/AIDS, and suddenly people said, oh, this is something that we were completely unprepared for and didn't know that it was coming and didn't know that such a disease could exist. And of course, since then, we've seen a whole lot more communicable diseases, including the one that we're in the middle of a pandemic of now, right? So the way that we learn about those unknown unknowns is through surprise. And what we need to do is we need to build enough resilience in the system so that if something comes completely out of left field, she says, gesturing from the right. So if something comes completely from one side that we're completely unprepared for, that the system is resilient enough that we can deal with it.
Okay. Thank you. So the next question asked by K.O. Chen. His question is there a starting point and end point if system is the first factor? And how do we identify this starting and end point?
That's a really good question, because a system is everything's connected to everything else, so there's no beginning and there's no end. But of course, we can't do any useful work in such circumstances. So what the point is that we have to understand that that the starting and end points that we work within are constructed. They're socially constructed, and other people would have different start points and different end points. And one of the reasons why we can't develop a perfect solution is because everybody has different start and end points, right? So what you need to do is, with your research team, you need to agree on how are we going to define this problem? What's inside what we're going to do and what's outside. But we need to understand that we make those decisions all the time, and we need to understand that they have implications, and they have implications for the things that can come and adverse unintended consequences that we're not prepared for.
Okay. Next, Inshen Lin from Academia Sinica saying, I was trained in leisure science, which is more integrated because we do environmental resources investigation and people survey. However, the process would be very long and outcomes sometimes very few. Do you have any suggestion to make this process more efficient?
I think that's these are great questions. Thank you. So this is one of the challenges to our field, right? If we're wanting to improve our ability to integrate and to implement, we have to figure out how to make things more efficient. At the moment, because we're so early in the development of this expertise, we don't have that level of sophistication yet. And it's one of the things that makes funding what we do hard, because we're competing against genome scientists and nuclear physicists and immunologists and a whole lot of other people who are working in areas that have been around for a very long time and that are very sophisticated and that have developed those efficiencies for doing things well. And we're still in a stage where we're not very confident about what we're doing. We're not very efficient about it, but we have to begin, and we have to start with where we are. And that developing that kind of efficiency is a really important part of our task in moving this field forward.
Good. So next one from Ayushi Sharma. He's from CYCU Taiwan, a PhD student in environmental health engineering. So question is, in today's world of multidisciplinary approach, is an expertise for everyone necessary? If not, how can we overcome this gap for everyone?
Thank you. So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, you're challenging my assertion that not everybody needs to be good at doing this kind of at the integration and implementation expertise, that we need people who are good engineers and good nuclear physicists and good immunologists. We need people with the disciplinary expertise, and then we need people who have expertise in bringing those together to work effectively on a complex problem. What I'd argue that the engineer and the immunologist and the nuclear physicist need is they need to understand that this other expertise exists and they need to respect it and be willing to work with it. So if I can use the statistics analogy again, most of us know that statistics exist. Some of you in the audience will be great statisticians. Some of you will be like me who know very little statistics, but I know enough to know when I need a statistician to work with me on a problem. And we need that same kind of understanding and expertise around integration and implementation. Everybody needs to know what they can comfortably and confidently do themselves, and when do they need to bring in somebody who has more expertise than they do to really help the team work together on this complexity effectively.
Thank you. Next question from Terry Cho at NTU, National Taiwan University. His question is how to prevent putting too many perspectives into project becoming a Christmas tree.
It's a great question, isn't it? You've got all these little baubles. So you've got this value system and there's this value system and he's got this interest and she's got this interest, and you could keep collecting diversity forever, right? And it's fascinating in and of itself, and it doesn't necessarily get you anywhere. This is a bit related to the efficiency question. We don't really know the answer. I think there's a sweet spot between working with people who are just like you, which means that you don't get very much novelty in what you do. You keep doing the same old, and working with so much diversity that you can't get past the Christmas tree effect, which is, wow, this is beautiful and interesting, but we're not achieving anything. So again, this is one of those long-term questions that we have to learn to answer. Where's the sweet spot between those? And again, you have to understand that if you don't have all the diversity at the table, and of course you cannot have all the diversity at the table, there are going to be things that you miss. So you might miss really important value systems, or you might miss a really important perspective on the problem. And so part of it is starting to get good at who are the critical people here that really need to be at the table. And this is why I always argue we need to think about the people who have the problem and the people who can do something about the problem. And then I guess the third group is us, the researchers, the people who have expertise, and figuring out who to have from those people. It's always going to be also constrained by time and money, but those shouldn't be your starting points. The starting point should be, what does the problem need in order for us to do it well?
Okay. Dori from Future Earth Taipei. So thanks for your awesome talk. When tackling complex interdisciplinary problems, we can think about systems, diversity, change, context, and unknown. As you mentioned, the stakeholder also plays an important role in the real world. I want to inquire, based on your experience, how to improve and promote the communication with stakeholders when tackling complex interdisciplinary problems. Any suggestion? That's your question.
Yeah, no, great question and really important. And I'm sorry I didn't deal with stakeholders in my talk, because I actually spend quite a lot of time thinking about how do we work effectively with stakeholders. So there's a question that goes back to the Christmas tree, figuring out which stakeholders you should have, figuring out how to work with them. And you can think about stakeholders in terms of how powerful they are, how much legitimacy they've got. So how much do they know about the problem? And there's also urgency. So is there, which stakeholders have, where do you need really quick action on a problem, and where can you take your time? And you can use those three things to prioritize the stakeholders. But you also need to be able to manage the different interests that stakeholders have. So there's a great tool called principled negotiation that allows you to manage competing interests. So there's a whole lot of really important tools for dealing with stakeholders and for incorporating them in your research effectively. And you need to decide whether you want to make them full partners in the research or whether you want to consult them. And regardless of what you do, it has to be a reciprocal relationship. So you don't always have to make stakeholders full partners, but if you consult them, if you get their opinion about what you're doing, then you also have some obligation to feed back to them about what it is that you've discovered and what you've done with the information that they've provided. So there's a whole lot of really important things about stakeholders. And if you go to both the blog and the website that I gave you earlier, you'll find tools on those for stakeholder engagement.
Okay. Next question from Shuqin Zhou at Geography Department in National Taiwan University. How do you design a relevant time frame for the synchronization of team members in I2S?
Yeah. So it's a good question. Usually we're not in the privileged position of being able to choose our own time frame. Usually we have the time frame kind of thrust upon us. We have funding for a year or for 5 years or whatever. So the funders often do that. But of course, funders are now also becoming a lot more attuned to this kind of research and are willing to work with researchers about saying, how much time do you need? So in this kind of research, there's a view that so if I can just move to funding for a minute, because I think it's relevant to your question. A lot of transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research is now funded in two stages. There's an initial stage where you bring the partners together to see if they can work with each other and develop a common problem framing and a common approach to the problem that they're all happy with. And then you fund them to actually do the work. And sometimes you'll find in that early stage that people drop off because they can't work with other people, or because it's not doing, they find that, they're not really that committed, and other people come on. So you need a time frame, which can be very long or very short, to bring the right team together. And then you actually need to do the work. And again, we haven't really figured out what an appropriate time frame is. So there have been projects that have spent 5 years just defining the question, right? This is a bit of the Christmas tree effect. They have a great time understanding each other's perspectives, but after 5 years, they've got nothing to show for it in terms of actually moving forward on the problem. On the other hand, you can get one person who really barrels ahead on the problem and comes up with an answer, but then they find that they've got no support because they haven't brought everybody along with them on it. So it's trying to find, again, the sweet spot between those two competing ways of working. And as I said, these are all issues that, this is an exciting time to be in this field because there's so much work that we need to do. There are so many exciting things to figure out about how to do this well.
Okay. Rebecca Fain from Academia Sinica. The question is, could you kindly share a bit more about practice tools, formal or not, that you have used in the past or present? It would be helpful to see them in an actual case. Thank you.
Rebecca, that's a great question. Thank you. So a lot of the research that the big research project that I did that led me to this thinking was to look at whether or not we should prescribe heroin to people who are dependent on heroin in Australia, and whether we should do a trial of this. And I worked with the police, with drug users, with policymakers, and with a whole range of disciplines. I worked with philosophers and sociologists and epidemiologists and the whole gamut of people who had something to say and something useful to offer on this perspective. And we did a whole lot of different things, but we used some dialogue methods for bringing people together. And so we had a workshop where we brought together researchers who are interested in the drug trade and the police. And we got them to really exchange perspectives on how they saw the drug market and what the impact of a trial on the drug market could be. We did some historical analysis of how things had happened in the past. So there had been similar sorts of initiatives. I'm finding it hard to answer your question on the run, but it's a really important question. I think it's one thing to say, here's this toolkit. It's really important to also have examples of how the tools have been used, because a lot of us learn from examples. I mean, one of the ways in which we're diverse is that we learn in different ways. So some of us learn from dot points, and I'm very much a dot point person, whereas other people learn from seeing something in action. There's a really nice toolkit for transdisciplinarity that is available, that the Swiss have constructed, called the TD Toolkit. And they have tools and examples of how they're used. And again, Rebecca, this is the kind of work that we need to do. We need to develop the tools and then develop a whole lot of examples of how to use them. In the book that I gave about dialogue, for each of the 14 dialogue methods, we have examples of how they've been used in environmental problems, health problems, and security problems predominantly.
Okay, and next one from Tailing Wang from NCKU, National Cheng Kung University in Taiwan. So thank you for the wonderful talk. As you mentioned, that complex problems are often embedded in systems with no clear boundaries, but time and resources are finite. How do you define a feasible project in that context?
So I guess a number of questions have kind of come at this, haven't they? So, so the temptation is always to start with the time and the resources, the time and the money that you've got. So, we've been funded to do something for 3 years with $3 million, right? Or whatever it is. And then we gather our friends, people that we've worked with in the past, and we do something. What I'm arguing is what this approach says is we should start with what the problem needs. So the problem may not need this person with whom I've collaborated very effectively in the past. What they've got to offer might be much less relevant. So by taking the kind of more expansive view, at least to start off with, so what is the problem need that we're dealing with now? Who are the stakeholders? Who is affected by this problem? Who is in a position to do something about it? Is it big business, or is it local business, or is it government policy, or is it a community group? So to really think through who's affected, who's in a position to do something, and then who is there in the academic world who can help shine a light on the problem that would make getting to a comprehensive understanding and a solution more likely. So I would argue that even though time and resources are finite, don't let them be what guides you initially. They have to guide you eventually. But initially, allow a period of time, maybe 2 or 3 months, where you really look at the problem from all its different perspectives, to think about what is the best project that I can do with the time and the resources that I have at my disposal. And you also need to, if you can, build a little bit of flexibility into the project, because I don't know about you, but I can never get everything right at the beginning. I prefer to kind of jump in and start, and then to bring in more people. It's you know, you're kind of working with somebody and you find out, oh, here's a really important bit that we've ignored. So we really need an historian to help us figure that out. And if you can have that kind of flexibility in your project, where you can bring in new people and new sub-projects as you need them, that can also be a really helpful thing to do. But it's also really important not to end up with a Christmas tree, right? You've got to think about what's the change that we're trying to support, and what do we need to be able to do that.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Gabriel. For the moment, I don't have any questions anymore. So maybe waiting for a little bit, but I really appreciate your effort, and I see a lot of interaction between our audience and you. So if no more question, I probably suggest we one more. One more. Let me just check it. Okay. Okay. So Sherry Cole answered asked the question: climate change may be the most complicated problem at this moment, but people often think it is a problem in the future. What expertise or value do you think it is necessary? Visionary perspective? That's the question.
Thank you. So, you know, I guess climate change is a great example of where a lot of this expertise has already been developed. So my focus is very much on the expertise rather than the problem, even though when we're doing this, it's the problem that's interesting, not the expertise, right? The expertise isn't useful in and of itself. The expertise is only useful in terms of what it helps us to develop, to do in terms of problems. And I think for climate change, really a lot of the work that's been done is exemplary. And climate change really shows us a lot of I mean, it's a huge problem. It's it involves everything and everybody, right? And that's what makes it so complex. And I guess what climate change really highlights is that when you are going up against really strong vested interests who make their living from doing things a particular way, there's going to be a lot of pushback. And it's something that we in research are not very used to. We're used to just kind of doing our research. We're not so good at the real world interaction that might also be involved. So, you know, I think there's from my perspective about expertise, there's a lot to be learnt from what the climate change people have done, both from what they've done well and from what they haven't done quite so well. And you know, it relates back to that question about examples. And there are some really great examples there that we can learn from and build on.
Okay, so I have one more question from Jackie Chan. How to prepare to get ready to start a dialogue with stakeholders with different experience and different values? Starting point.
So I guess it's about being willing to listen. And one of my strongest experiences when I was doing the research on heroin prescription was that in the end, both sides, people who were supportive of it and people who were against it, were using my research to support their argument. I always thought that was a really good outcome. But you will only learn from people if you respectfully listen to what they've got to tell you. And so it's really important to work with people who have perspectives on the problem that might be in agreement with your perspectives, but also who have perspectives on the problem that are different from yours. And one of the characteristics that I think you need to have to do this kind of work is to be able to put your own perspectives to one side and respectfully listen to people who might see the world very differently from you. So I think there's a lot of listening that it's starting a dialogue by listening, really. So you need to make it clear to people why they're there, why they're in the room, why you're interested in what they've got to say, because you don't want them talking about their grandmother or their cat or whatever. You want them to be talking about the problem at issue. But you need to be able to open a space where people can really also, if they see the problem differently from the way that you've defined it, you need to open a space that allows them to say, well, you know, you've asked me to talk about this, but for me, the important issue is really that. So it's setting up a container for the conversation that allows people to tell you what is really of concern to them so that you can take that into account in your research. And I might just give an advertisement for this week's blog post. So there's a blog post on listening-based dialogue, which is on the blog this week, which really gives some tips, Jackie, that answer the question that you've addressed. But if you also look at the website, there are some some suggestions for how to run a stakeholder engagement.
Okay. Yeah, we prepare for 20 minutes discussion. Now we have already 32 minutes already. It's wonderful. So maybe a last question or last two questions I have now from Li Chaoli. Joe, he say, Joe from TRIWRI, Triwar, I don't know what it is. So as you mentioned that the solution can only be partial and temporary, in reality, sometimes one solution can be the problem of the other issues. Do you have any suggestion to reduce these trade-offs?
Thank you for raising trade-offs, because that's exactly what. So rather than looking for perfection, what we've got to look for is trade-offs. So what are the trade-offs that we want to make? And you know, this question really hits the nail on the head of what the problem is, but we don't yet have a solution to it. And again, you know, in that great array of things that we need to do to develop this expertise, understanding trade-offs and how to make good trade-offs is really one of the critical issues. So what I've tried to indicate is that there is about a lot of expertise out there, but there are also a lot of important questions that we still don't know the answer to in order to harness this expertise most effectively for dealing with complex problems.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. I think we probably can suggest to stop here. So I would like to really thank everybody to participate this forum and ask a lot of questions, and especially thank you, Gabriel Bammer. Gabriel, thank you very much. So really give us a wonderful talk and really fruitful discussion among the participants. So thank you very much. And as planned, we will put this YouTube stream on YouTube site, so people want to see this forum can look at the search in YouTube site to find this again. Okay. Anything you want to say from Gabriel?
Well, look, thank you very much too. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I mean, this is an area that I'm passionate about, as you can probably tell. And thank you for a wonderful discussion. I hadn't quite meant to make the talk quite as short as it was. I probably went way too fast. I apologise for that. but I really did want to have time for discussion, and it was a great discussion. It's always terrific to see how people are thinking about these issues, and I can see that there's really a lot of you that are thinking about these issues in a really productive way. And as I said, I really hope that you'll also contribute to the blog. Thank you very much.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Gabriel. And as a ICOE Taipei, after this, we are still continue to maybe have the next one foreign master foreign series. We don't set the timetable, but in probably later this year we have the third one for doing that. So thank you everybody. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you again. So goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you.